Hello, and thank you for joining the podcast Emergency Minute. Your host is an emergency medicine physician who brings over 20 years of experience in healthcare. Dr. Parente will take you through some of the trending topics and challenges faced in the ER and all of healthcare. Join in the fight against misinformation, and don't forget to follow on social media at Dr. J. Parente. Now, here's your host, Dr. John Parente.
Welcome back, everyone, to Emergency Minute. Hard to believe that this is my first show for 2026. For that, I apologize. But to be honest, I lost my dad very suddenly, very unexpectedly, and I needed to step away from the constant grind that is life. So this is episode number 31, or episode number 1 for 2026. That being said, I am back. I am better than before. I am funnier than before, or at least I think I'm pretty funny. And I'm thrilled to be bringing you some amazing shows that I've lined up for 2026. Want to know about AI in healthcare? Want to hear more about physician and executive burnout and what we can do about it? Want to know what it's like to fly in one of the Blue Angels? This is what I have lined up for Emergency Minutes so far, with more amazing episodes to come. Now, today's topic is terrifying, but also very important. We are having a conversation with a medical malpractice attorney who's going to give us some pretty amazing insight that's not just helpful to physicians, PAs, nurse practitioners, but also to patients and nurses. So some of this may terrify you, but honestly, some of it may surprise you. So let's welcome today's guest, Stephen Crandall. He's a highly respected medical malpractice attorney with a very unique perspective on both sides of the legal system. Steve began his career in 1994 as a defense attorney and represented many of the major hospitals and physician groups across Ohio for a decade. He then made the switch to the plaintiff side, bringing that insider knowledge with him. And in 2011, he founded his own firm, which has since grown to 6 offices across 2 states, focusing on complex medical malpractice cases. Now, beyond the courtroom, Steve has been deeply involved in educating both physicians as well as attorneys, and he's spoken at multiple hospitals across Ohio, worked with the Ohio Association of Justice, and has even led seminars, including mock trials on birth injury cases, to help physicians better understand the legal landscape that we're all practicing in. He's been recognized as one of the top attorneys in the state, ranked multiple times as the number 2 lawyer in all of Ohio by Super Lawyers, and has received the highest possible ratings for ethics and skill from the Martindale, Hubble, Avo, and Best Lawyers in America. Outside of work, he's a husband, a father, someone who's very driven, and someone who may like to travel even more than me. All right, Steve, really excited to have you on the show. Welcome. Thank you for joining me on Emergency Minute.
Absolutely. Happy to join you. Love talking about medical malpractice cases.
Yeah, I think this is something that we can all benefit from, patients, doctors, lawyers, whoever else may be listening out there. One of the interesting things of your career that I found so fascinating is that you started off on one side, on the defense side, and then had moved over to the plaintiff side. I'd love to hear your take on how that occurred. And is this normal for lawyers to take this path?
I did start out as a defense lawyer. I did that for about 10 years. I've been a lawyer for 32 years. So as I sit here, I have still tried more cases as a defense lawyer than I have as a plaintiff lawyer. And I would say when I look at a case, I still look at it 100% from a perspective of a defense lawyer. I would say it's not uncommon for people on the plaintiff side, the patient side, to have been a defense lawyer. But I think it's definitely in the distinct minority. I think it gives me an advantage because I look at a case from the defense side. I give all the benefit of the doubt to the defense side. And if it doesn't, meet all of the elements, one of the biggest, I think, goals in my job is to make sure I explain to the patients, A, what happened? And then B, you do not have a case. And this is the reason why. And I think the fact that I'd done defense work for so long gives me the ability to do that.
Yeah, I imagine that would give you the perspective to be able to see both sides of it pretty impartially, right? I mean, that's the kind of the goal there.
Yeah, I've turned down many, many cases that other lawyers have picked up and tried to run with. Sometimes they're successful, most of the time they're not. But I tell people, look, if I get about 500 cases in the door, let's say, phone calls, emails a month, I might order records on 2 or 3 out of those 500 cases. That's how stringent we are because medical malpractice is a difficult market. But it's also because I'm a medical purist. If it medically isn't 100% accurate that there was negligence, I think it's my job to explain to this family, no matter how tough it is, why there's no case here.
Yeah, and I think that's something we see in the ER quite a bit as far as, the bad news about emergency medicine is that there are a lot of bad outcomes. And unfortunately, when that happens, people want to have an area to blame. They do.
Yes, for sure.
I just lost my father, and I'm thinking to myself, like, what could I have done differently as a physician? Should I have gotten him this? Should I have done that? Did the paramedics, do everything they were supposed to do? And it's always difficult when sometimes, this stuff just happens and everything went right and bad things happen to patients, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I'll add to that and say that whenever there's a bad outcome, I think unfortunately there's some things seeping into society today where, you just want to blame people. And one of the other things is kind of a lack of self-awareness on the patient's behalf in terms of what role they played in it. And for me, if a patient has abused themselves or not followed medical advice or not followed up on test results themselves, especially with my chart available, those are case enders for me. Because I think it's easy for a jury to say, hey, listen, you're blaming the physician, but you smoked, you drank too much, you didn't take your medication, you didn't take care of your diabetes. And by the way, there were labs on my chart that the physician may not have followed up on, but you had access to them as well. And I think those are things that must really annoy care providers. And I just want to say, in a medical malpractice arena, they have significant negative effects to a patient's case. Like, jurors do not like that. So just understand, if a patient has done things wrong, I think it's most likely going to be a defense verdict for that case.
Well, that's good to hear, because that, I think the common perception amongst physicians, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to have this show with you on, and I'm so grateful that you're on, is that a lot of physicians really don't know. And there's that old expression, you don't know what you don't know. We don't know a lot of this, information surrounding this. And our perception is just that this is this evil area, and, and we have to do everything, in our power. And I'll tell you, there's a lot of times where we are powerless. I had a case this week where I had a guy that was in septic shock from an infection, was on pressors for maintaining blood pressure, and was in the ER for like 12 hours. And would not be admitted to the hospital.
Oh, goodness.
And we had social work involved. We had the urologist come in. We had nurses talk to him, patients talk to him, myself. Everybody's talking to this guy. And this dude was like, I am walking out of this hospital. I'm like, well, he's alert. He's oriented. This is a really high risk case. We made him sign out the AMA, and we're like, and so, my only hope is that he has a good outcome, despite, everybody telling him this is not a good situation. But it makes you, we spend a lot of resources on that with that against medical advice situation. And, hopefully that does give us some, legal protection if it ever comes to a bad outcome in that situation.
For sure. And I mean, obviously documentation is important in that instance. One of the things I want to make clear to the physicians and care providers who are justifiably afraid of being sued, and kind of this whole idea that it's a system run amok, is it's really the opposite. I have been in this business 32 years. I'm as objective as they come. I will tell you that there is no area of law that's more difficult to be successful than on the plaintiff's or patient's side of a medical malpractice case. Honestly, there are more hurdles for us to overcome. There are more evidence rules stacked in the physician's favor. There are laws and decisions coming out of the Supreme Court that 100% favor hospitals and physicians and care providers. It is extremely difficult. Now, I will tell you that this whole kind of political landscape has affected jury verdicts inside the state of Ohio over the last 3 to 4 years, really since the pandemic, but increasingly so. We have seen really, really significant verdicts. And it is plaintiffs' lawyers, I guess, belief that it's kind of a reflection of this anger that is seeping out of society. And it's just anger at institutions and a little bit of physicians, unfortunately, because of the misinformation and disinformation about, COVID. But I would say, that's the only temper I have, is that if it's a bad case, care providers should be objectively looking through the case and urging their insurance company to try to get it settled, because there is danger there. But those cases are few and far between. It's very difficult to get a successful case to verdict on my side of the fence now.
So what are some of the common mistakes that you see, or some of the things that are like smaller issues that physicians can then, maybe inadvertently turn into bigger problems?
So let me tell you 3 common mistakes that I see in cases that I get. Okay, the first one is common along any care provider line. I do see it in the ER, in the urgent care and primary care settings, but it is when an a patient comes in and the care provider kind of rushes to judgment. Okay, it could be, oh, we got a virus going around, or, I think this is a URI instead of DVT and PE. And so they rush to that decision. And then, you've heard of confirmation bias. That is what goes hand in hand. Is I see people not have a wide differential diagnosis, not rule out worst first. They come to a conclusion that it's like constipation instead of intussusception, let's say. And there's data and information, images, labs, vital signs that would, prompt them to be like, hey, wait a minute, maybe it's not constipation, but they filter it through this idea that that's what it is. And they end up missing the boat. The second thing that I see is in the world of EMR, we all use templates now, right? And a lot of times, this isn't the physician provider's problem, or I should say, they're not to blame. But the second thing I see is that they may have time limitations because of insurance reimbursements. You got 15 minutes to see a patient. You've got a certain number of volume of patients you need to push through. When you put those 2 things together, I'm seeing a lot of rushed notes that aren't accurate. And, a lot of times clients are calling me, they're like, listen, this note bears no resemblance to what occurred that day. And then when I take depositions of the care providers, I'm able to show through having them highlight their template note, what is on the template note versus what was the note for my client. And a lot of times it's 95% the template note. That may be true, but it immediately raises the specter that physician did not spend a lot of time with the patient and the notes kind of made up. So I would be very careful of template notes. The third thing is something I'm sure you would imagine, but it's a miscommunication amongst subspecialties that may be involved in a patient. Guy has a stroke. Neurology stroke says, hey, listen, here's his medication plan. Let's do ASA for a while. Then we'll switch to Eliquis after we do a CT scan to make sure he has no further hemorrhage in the brain. They go ahead and get the CT scan, sees the neurosurgeon, cleared to go on Eliquis. But the people who were supposed to put him back on it didn't communicate with the neurology stroke team, and they don't put him back on. And then, unfortunately, he has the devastating stroke. So it's a lot of communication issues amongst subspecialties who are taking care of a patient. And I think, again, that's just because everyone is super busy, and I see kind of an exhausted care, team out there right now.
Yeah, for sure. Those are some great examples. So I appreciate you sharing. The template thing is terrifying to me because I use my templates. I have to. I see 60 patients in 12 hours. Like there's no way for me not to. But I'll never forget one of my first shifts as an attending. I admitted this patient, had a templated exam, sent the patient upstairs, and God bless this hospitalist. He calls down to me and he goes, hey, I just want to let you know on your exam template, I know you're new and you're a new physician. It said that you had like good peripheral pulses in your lower extremities. The guy's a bilateral amputee. And I'm like, yeah, all right. Yep. That's I definitely need to get that cleaned up. So I always teach the residents, if you put something in your exam, whether it's templated or not, that's not there, that's fraudulent. Like you have to, I know the templates make us faster. And in the emergency room, the reality is we have to use them. We have to be fast. We have to be efficient, but you also have to use them intelligently. And so that's been a big focus of mine because I do use the templates, but I'm very careful to go through every single system. Like, okay, skin, heart, lung. Oh, no, I didn't listen to the heart. Erase that because I cannot sit on the stand and say, oh, doctor, did you listen to his heart? And well, no. but it says right here that they're, regular rate and rhythm. So, so there's certain things that we have to clean up. So the template's a huge thing that I really stress to my residents all the time.
Yeah. And you're teaching them the right thing because you have to go through each section. And, what jumps out sometimes to me is if there's a 4-year-old and they leave in the template that they're not chewing tobacco, drinking alcohol, or using illicit drugs, and that tells me that they didn't go through every, system. So I understand the need for a template, but you need to make sure that you differentiate that template or add things or subtract things to make sure that it substantiates you spent time with the patient. But it's definitely a risk factor in today's medicine.
Yeah, definitely. And it's still useful. And look, the other day, just yesterday, I worked a shift and we got just nailed up front in the emergency room. And it's just me and a physician assistant. And at one point we had, I think there was like 18 or 20 active patients in the department that had all signed in less than a minute, less than 1 hour. So I'm juggling, 20 human lives right now.
Right.
And I literally sat down, stopped for a second. I got out a sheet of paper and I'm like, if I had time, what would I do right now? I would review room 3's medication list more thoroughly. Number 5, I need to go back and figure out where their surgical records are. And I just made a list because I'm like, I don't have time right now to delve into each of these problems. So I need to prioritize what do I need to do right now to make sure everyone's alive and I'm not missing anything. But it's when you're on the, when you're under the gun like that, nobody really cares if they're that 15th or 20th patient that something does get missed and they do have a bad outcome. I always tell my residents, being an ER physician, you're juggling 1,000 balls. You're going to drop some.
For sure.
You just need to make sure the ones that drop are not important. And they're not, look at those vital signs. If you're sending somebody home and they have abnormal vital signs, you better have a very good reason why. And you have to have it documented as to you had this discussion. This is why, so it's just, I always say the attorneys don't care if there's 20 patients in the waiting room. You have to still do your due diligence, but it is tough. It's a balance. I mean, it really is.
It is. I'll give you an ER example that I've seen recently that drives that point home is an individual who comes in with really severe abdominal pain. And, the ER doctor will order, let's say, a CT with or without contrast. Maybe he doesn't do a CTA at that point. And there's a clot in the superior mesenteric artery that the radiologist misses. Okay. And what I see a lot is that the ER physicians will, once they get that negative CT, they're done, right? They've kind of written that patient off, but the nurses continue to follow the patients. And I have significant abnormalities and vital signs in 10 out of 10 pain, right? So now you've got pain out of character and you did a CT scan. That's not the gold standard. What should you do? And I think that's an easily missed issue. They send the patient home and they come back the next day and, their entire small bowel's dead. One of the things I want to drive home, I'm obviously still very partial to care providers. I have never seen more cases come in my law firm over the last 3 to 4 years, volume wise, monthly and annually. And I've never seen bigger damages. Okay. I think the system is broken from my standpoint, but I don't know the answer to this, but I know who's at fault, and it's the insurance companies. 100% our insurance system that we have set up has put pressure on physicians and care providers that is leading to this volume of cases and these bad outcomes. You no longer can just practice medicine. You don't have the time to do it. You've got all this pressure to fit volumes of patients in, to spend less time with them, or you don't get reimbursed. And until somebody, and I don't know the answer to it, I'm not smart enough to know that. But number one, it's not your guys' fault, and number two, no one's doing anything about it, at least that I've heard about nationally. And I think it's really one of those unreported issues in our country, unfocused on issues.
Yeah, and I've touched on this on multiple other episodes for Emergency Minute, just how broken healthcare is. And yeah, it does start somewhat with the insurance companies because there are so many limitations. And it's every day somebody gets sent to our emergency department because they can't get the insurance to approve a CT scan, or they can't. I had a case about a year or two ago, and I did a video on it that was very popular video where this woman had come in to see me in the emergency room because she was having this abdominal pain, and she had been fighting with the insurance company to get this, I think it was an ultrasound of the pelvis approved for months. And finally, she
Yeah.
just grew tired of it. She came to the ER and ended up doing a CT scan, and she was just riddled with cancer. And it's a terrifying story because, in hindsight, yeah, that woman should have, gone to their family doctor, come to the ER sooner or whatever. But that's easy to say. In reality, she was trying to do the right thing. She was trying to go to her, GYN physician to get the ultrasound. It just wasn't getting approved. And by the time we made the diagnosis, she had metastatic cancer. You could make the argument that had that not happened, we could have caught something sooner, had a hysterectomy, whatever the case may have been, it could have had a much better outcome. So it's terrifying to see this stuff. And unfortunately, I don't think the average American, I think they're starting to become aware of how bad this is. And it's not just the system. It's not always the physician's fault, but it's the system that's broken. And I think that's where, one of the other things I wanted to talk to you about was the broken healthcare system. I think I'm not that I'm trying to remove blame from the physicians, but I guess my question is how much of this is system failure that you see versus physician failure?
I think it's almost 100%, system failure, honestly. You've got the situation that you outlined, which is that people can't get tests that their physicians think they need. But I think the bigger problem is kind of a combination of insurance companies that only reimburse, a certain amount for a procedure. So as a surgeon, if you're only getting half of what you used to get, it's just human nature. You're going to try to push as many people through the system as you can. And I understand why people do it, but that's not good for the patients. That's not good for their practice because they're going to have to talk to all those people post-operatively. And now you've just got an exhausted surgeon, And then I think the other thing is private equity entering the medical profession, I think is an absolute double thumbs down. I don't know how it happened. I don't know how it's legal, but it is. And I've seen instance after instance where these private equity groups buy up, like, let's say a big orthopedic practice. And when you get those contracts, and they try to fight me from getting them, when you get those employment contracts, you see how much pressure is on that physician because their employment and their wages are based on metrics. And they're metrics to push, more surgeries or more aggressive surgeries or more patients through the practice because it's a profit-driven business. That is going to result in more cases, for various reasons, because you're doing a surgery you shouldn't be doing. And during that surgery, they become paralyzed. Now you got big problems because the post-op patient called in with a problem and you're too exhausted to think it through because of how much volume's going through, and you just put them off, and then they end up dying of DVT and PE. I really think, people smarter than me need to sit down. Someone has to pay attention to what's going on, because unless you're either a physician or someone in my, area of expertise, you don't know what a madhouse it is inside a hospital right now. And you don't know how many bad outcomes are going on. It's really kind of sad to see right now.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I unfortunately have a front row seat to that, being a director for the emergency room for 20 years in my career. It's horrifying. And that's one of my messages on social media. I make a lot of content. Some of it's educational, some of it's an attempt at humor. But the drive home message is, you really have to be an advocate for yourself. And if something doesn't sound or feel right, it's okay to ask again. It's okay to be respectful and say, have we thought this through? Have we, there are other options and things. And one of the biggest things that I see now is the inability to transfer patients to higher levels of care. And this was never an issue pre-COVID. Pre-COVID, we're in a small community hospital. If you have something, that we really don't take care of at a community hospital, that you need a larger system, we would simply fly you to Cleveland, Toledo, Akron, whatever. And the patient would get their care. They'd leave in an hour in a helicopter and everybody would, move on with their lives. And what's happening now post-COVID is that there's a nursing shortage across the country. And so people don't have beds. They do have beds. They don't have nurses for those beds. And even in big places. And so we call these places, and there are some facilities, I'm not going to use names, of course, but there are some facilities that I call, they accept the patient, and then they're stuck in our hospital for 4 or 5 days. And it's absolutely terrifying. And we find ourselves in this really tough position in the emergency room because I'm like, I know the limitations of the system right now, and I find myself having some really tough conversations with patients and families. The fastest way for you to get care right now at a place that you need is to discharge yourself from our hospital and have someone drive you to that larger system that said they're going to take you, but they don't have any beds for 5 days. So then they just show up at their front door, which is a sticky situation to begin with, but I know it's the fastest path for that patient to get there.
Yeah.
And quite frankly, some patients aren't stable enough to do that. So it puts us in this position in the ER. And if you don't have a supportive hospital, God help you, because at least in our hospital, the hospitalists will come down, the specialists will come down if they're stuck in the ER, and they will help us manage these patients and their care. But so many times now, this inability to transfer has become a huge issue. And then it's boarding in the ER, and then there's patients in the waiting room, and it's just like this huge sort of clog in the system. Have you seen any of the things that relate to that?
Yeah, you raised, 2 points I wanted to talk about that I see cases on. And again, I think it's all tied back to the insurance industry. And the first one is, I see non-physicians in physician where I would typically see physicians over decades in those roles. I see PAs, CNPs in the ER all the time. Like I would say it's a minority for me to look at an ER record and I'm evaluating the care and treatment of an MD or DO. It is overwhelmingly a PA or CNP. Same thing in the urgent care setting. Same thing in the office-based setting post-operatively, where there's risk and there's danger. And, I think PAs and CNPs are fantastic. I think it's great training. But, in many cases, physicians have forgot more about a situation than they know. And I see that in cases. I see situations where I know a physician would not have made that mistake. And that is an overburdened system. They have to have all these physician extenders because they can't keep up with the volume. And then the second thing is what you just touched upon. I see a situation where someone has a critical issue, needs a workup, and or needs a transfer. And the common public would be stunned of how long that takes in the United States of America today. And I think that's why we're seeing a rise in morbidity and mortality in situations like pregnant moms. Like I'm seeing pregnant moms having strokes, dying, and then delivering the baby. It's like I'm reviewing cases in a third world country. But it's happening here in the United States because mom can't get the care that she needs in a timely fashion. And it is a completely exhausted and overworked system because of the insurance companies. And they're just driving, reimbursements down. They want you guys to have more volume with less staff. Last thing I'll say, kind of a 2A, is you're right. I see nurses with 2-year degrees instead of 4-year degrees, 1-year experience, maybe less, and they're in an ICU setting. That is unfair to that nurse and that system. They are completely over their head. And they're going to miss a lot of things that well-trained and experienced nurses would have caught. And that's simply because there's a shortage. And so they're rushing these people into roles that are over their head. They really have no choice. They've got to fill a body. But you put all that together and it's a catastrophe right now, honestly.
Yeah. And I definitely feel it is unfair, most importantly to the patient, but it's unfair to us in healthcare as providers because we care. We want to deliver good care. We also have to be fast and efficient in that care. And when you have 20 people boarding in the ER, 35 people in the waiting room, and the place is just chaos, like how is anyone in that situation getting good care? I mean, I worked at one hospital where we constantly were getting phone calls from positive troponin cardiac enzymes that were in the waiting room. I'm like, this is a nightmare. I'm going to get sued for a patient I don't even know anything about. I've not even seen this patient, but I took the phone call. I've now looked at the ZKG. I'm like, can we find a spot, a hallway, a closet? Like, is there any place we could put this patient? I'm actually going to do a podcast later this year, and it's going to be titled The Most Dangerous Room in the Hospital. And it's going to be all about the ER waiting room because it is truly terrifying.
It is. I think if I could single out any area that has been hit the hardest, it's ERs. And you talked about the patient's perspective, which I think is admirable to you, but I think to myself, like, how could any of the ER physicians, put up with what they put up with every single day, shift after shift, month after month? You're understaffed. You have too many patients. You can't transfer in places because they're booked. They don't have beds. You're trying to get studies done. They take forever to get done. You have people, I've had a number of cases with people in the ER waiting rooms who just drop dead or code, and they've been triaged. But it's not that you guys were sitting back there twiddling your thumbs. Like, you had no beds. You guys were at capacity. Like, what do you do? And that goes on every day in every major city in Ohio. And our politicians aren't doing anything about it. Like nobody is, honestly. It's just, it's absolutely crazy. And I don't think the normal or common person who hasn't had to go to an ER knows this.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think Washington's just as culpable in this as well, because they, I'm not a big like government fix the problem, government regulation guy. I usually like to have, corporations and businesses just kind of function on their own. But right now with the insurance companies, they kind of have this monopoly on everything. And the only people that can fix it are the people in Washington. But I'm not sure the people in Washington have any desire to fix it. Because they're so in bed with some of the monies with the insurance companies, et cetera. I mean, the Medicare formula, obviously wildly flawed and continues to go down every year, despite the fact that our resources and cost of living and cost of goods and services and everything else is going up. So it's causing this crisis. And to your point, I don't know how to fix it, but I know it's going to take somebody bigger than me to do it. But it has definitely brought the system to its knees. And, I used to say healthcare is breaking but it's basic. I think it's just completely broken at this point.
It is. And I think the only solution, it sounds like a simple one, but it's true, is that the decisions and what goes on inside a hospital has to go back to be 100% in the hands of the care providers. The insurance companies cannot direct care anymore. And I think private equity has to get out of medicine. Physicians have to run the ship, because when you guys say something needs to happen, it needs to happen regardless of cost. But not to get political, but I think it's the reality. The reason why it's not going to change is the insurance companies have money, and it's a lucrative business for the politicians not to do anything. And it's going to have to, it's going to get to a crisis level where the common public is just saying enough is enough. And, I don't know how long that's going to take, but it doesn't seem like it's going to happen anytime soon.
Well, and you think about the downstream effects of defensive medicine too. Like one of the things that we do in the ER, and we're accused of it, probably rightfully so, is defensive medicine. I had a patient yesterday that had 50 CT scans since 2022, 50 scans.
That's crazy.
But the person comes in and they have stroke-like symptoms and they're relatively youngish, and you're like, what's the acceptable number for me to miss? You know what I mean? So what's easier for me to do the scan, prove that there's nothing wrong again, and then, go from there, or don't do the scan, send the patient home, and the person who cries wolf and has had 50 CT scans, maybe they actually do have something wrong with them this time. And then I'm fried because I didn't meet the standard of care. So, the downstream effects of radiation exposure, cost, clogging up the ER for resources, that's something that we don't usually talk about.
Yeah. And I feel for you in that situation. There's a couple things I wanted to highlight that you could do to avoid a lawsuit. Even in this kind of chaotic system that we've talked about, one of the strangest things that I see, and by strange, I mean that it continues to persist, even though it defies common sense, is that when there's a bad outcome of any kind, I see physicians avoid the patient and avoid the family. And I can promise you that is most likely going to avoid in them visiting me to investigate the case. And who knows what I'm going to find at that point. And I don't know why care providers and physicians do that. If they spent, and there's been, there's an article in New England Journal of Medicine that highlights this, that if a physician or care provider spends that time with the patient, sits by their bedside and says, listen, this is what happened in the OR. I've never had it happen before. I did all of the things that I normally do, and I did them correctly. And despite that, this is the outcome that you had. I want you to know that I'm sorry that this happened. It wasn't anything I did wrong. And I want you to know I'm going to try to do everything I can in my powers now to make you as well as you can be, to get over this complication. If they spend the time, that patient and their family, with honestly, I would say with 90% certainty, are not going to go see a plaintiff's lawyer. Okay. The opposite, where you just ignore them or you send your PA or they never see the surgeon again, they're going to go see a lawyer just because they don't even know what happened, let alone, I think that I'm ticked off that my surgeon didn't bother to see me. The other thing I want to highlight in this conversation that you're having is Ohio has an apology statute. Okay. I mentioned at the outset that there are a lot of statutes that protect physicians. The apology statute is one of them. What it means is if you sit at bedside and you tell people, like, listen, here's this complication. I am sorry it happened. You could even say, I was to blame for it. Okay. And I'm not suggesting every complication is that. But if it's a recognized complication and you explain that and apologize, or if it's, something that you did wrong and you apologize for that, none of that can come into evidence at all. Yeah, a lot of physicians don't. And so it would benefit you for a lot of reasons to sit down and talk with the patient and explain everything and just apologize. Just make sure you put that in there. Listen, I'm really sorry this happened to you. From the bottom of my heart, I didn't want this to happen and it happened to you. And I'm going to do everything I can. I'm going to be here with you along the way to see if we can't get that nerve injury back. And, you've avoided a lawsuit and none of that is admissible if they decide to try to sue you for any reason.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. And I'm glad that you brought that up because that's something that if I'm sure there's a lot of physicians out there that probably don't know that as well.
Oh yeah. Cause there's times patients come to me and the physician does fall on their sword. And I'm like, did he say I'm sorry? And they're like, no. And I'm like, all right, it's admissible. It's really not going to carry much weight, to be honest with you. But they didn't know about the statute and they didn't apologize. They didn't protect themselves, So that's very important for people to know.
Well, and I think situations like this can help us learn, like, how do we, handle these types of situations? One of the cases was brought to me that was sort of terrifying. Sometimes I do review cases from time to time. One was brought to me was a patient that ended up having a aortic dissection. The CT was ordered appropriately by the ER physician pretty quickly, but there was such a backlog with the CT scanner and the strokes and the traumas and everything else that this patient ended up waiting 3 or 4 hours prior to getting the CT scan, ended up having a bad outcome. And I remember reviewing this case and it was very peripheral and I ended up not taking the case for whatever reason, but I just was terrified. And basically it came down to the fact that the hospital did not have a policy on, sort of these super stat, I guess I would call them, images to be done, because everything in the ER is stat, which is always problematic in my mind, because there are certain things that, need to be done right away. And then there are certain things that need to be done right now. So I think sometimes these cases we can learn from them and actually increase, public safety, because I immediately went back to my hospital and I was like, we need a policy right now for, when there is this type of situation, there's a suspected aortic dissection, we need to, act quickly and get that patient over to CT right away. And it's something that we've kind of been doing anyways. We always just kind of call over and say like, hey, we're not going to wait for the creatinine. This patient needs to be number one on your list. Let's get this done. But now we can have some policy to kind of formalize it. So I do think sometimes these cases can kind of increase public safety and help us. Have you seen things like that before in your line of work as well, where some of these cases actually lead to some improvement?
I'd like to think that if I'm involved in a case that results in a significant settlement or a verdict, that from a financial standpoint, that would motivate the institution to make changes. I'm powerless though to see those things through, which I know a lot of my clients are very upset about, but I tell them that, in a civil case, the only thing that changes hand is money. And they can tell me at a mediation, like, listen, Steve, we've changed policies and procedures. And I hope that they're being honest that they have, but there's nothing that I can put in the settlement that would say, prove it or show it to us or things like that. There's too many issues involved in that. But I would definitely say there's been instances where, for example, I'm thinking about a case in an urgent care and there was a lot of heavy template use and it resulted in septic shock for a 4-year-old. So he has all 4 limbs amputated, septic shock from strep throat, and brain damage to boot. And I definitely know that system made changes in terms of how much of a template can be filled out, pre-filled out for that patient. So I think that's going to drive some improvement in care. But look, that's the weird thing about the dynamic between physicians and plaintiffs lawyers. Like, I know I'm not well liked on your side, but when you really look at it objectively, let's just use an example. Like, there's an issue in anesthesia. Okay. And so my side gets on that issue. and we bring up 20 cases and we hit the anesthesiologist pretty hard because there was a defect in their system and it led to, let's say, deaths. Okay, instead of disliking us, they should say, wait a minute, they've identified a problem that we need to fix now for patient safety. And then it would be fixed and the cases would go away and care would improve. It's that kind of symbiotic relationship I think is missing. Is there should be some kind of communication where, like what we're doing today, like, where do you see cases? Okay, how do we improve on that? Not, I don't like you because you're hitting us with a verdict. I mean, we're hitting you with a verdict because there's a problem in the system. And if it happens more perpetually, I think that would raise awareness on the institution or system side to try to fix it, and cut those cases off and improve care.
Yeah, I agree. And I will tell you from the hospital I work at, which is just, this very small, field of medicine. Obviously there's I can't speak to the rest of the country or even the rest of the state for that matter, but we do a good job of finding when we do see that Swiss cheese model and there's something that slips through the cracks and we say, okay, where are the holes in this process? The facility does a good job of going back and saying, okay, we got to fix this process. Let's, before it gets to litigation or before it leads to a bad outcome, what can we do to fix the holes that are in that Swiss cheese model? So I do think, at least from where I'm seeing and where I'm sitting, especially being a director, I do see a large amount of effort being put into fixing some of these processes, especially when things go wrong or when things almost go wrong, which is probably even better to do. And so I think that's encouraging. And from your perspective of having these conversations, that's why I wanted to have you on today. But I think this conversation should take place at every medical school and every residency in the country, because this is something that I never had in my training and is kind of a terrifying thing.
Yeah, I'll give you a quick example. I do see a lot of cases that happen when there's a decrease in the level of care. For example, the most amazing cardiac surgery will be done, like literally almost a miraculous surgery. Patients in CVICU, everything the first 5 or 6 days goes perfectly. Then the patient goes to the step-down unit, and literally within 24 hours, all hell has broken loose for that patient. And there's just a steep drop off in the quality of care, the nursing care that I see going from an ICU setting to a step down. And intertwined in that, something that I've seen, maybe 10 years ago that has disappeared is the nurse's lack of knowledge over how powerful something like Dilaudid is. And so when they go from the ICU to the step down, patient gets there, is getting acclimated, maybe has obstructive sleep apnea, and they push, 1 milligram or 2 milligrams of Dilaudid, and they go do something before they get the patient on the monitor. And then they come back to the room and they find a patient who's either completely dead or coded or coding. And so we had a lot of those cases, like right in a row, maybe 10 years ago. Those have dried up. And so obviously I think the system has determined, like, hey, listen, you can't do that. They've educated nurses on the power of Dilaudid versus morphine. They've educated them on getting them on the monitor right away once the patient comes off transfer. We've seen less and less of those cases. So that's an example of, an area of care that I think is tightened up because of what we have done in the legal world.
So what are some things, like physician wise that we can do on our side to, avoid getting sued, whether it be documentation, what have you? What are some things that you think that we can do better overall as a profession?
Well, this is where it gets difficult. I mean, it all comes down to how much time that you can spend with a patient, and you all are under the gun, because of what we already talked about. So I don't know. It's, obviously documentation is important. Spending time with the patient is important. Not jumping to conclusions and using confirmation bias. One thing I do want to touch on that I don't think physicians and care providers know a lot about is the electronic medical record. And I want to talk about like a case that happens. Let's say, there's a phrase that a physician used with me when I was early in my career as a defense lawyer, and it always stuck with me. And he said, Steve, it's tough to be human sometimes. And it is, because you're not always going to make the right decision. Okay. There is, and there are negligent cases out there. Okay. And that just happens. That's why you have insurance. Okay. What I have seen and what I don't think care providers realize is they take that negligence and they compound it and make it 100 times worse for themselves by going back into the electronic medical record and erasing something or making changes to the record. And I want to make sure people understand that there are audit trails and there are companies that I hire who have Epic software engineers who know Epic or know any other EMR inside and out that will catch you. And at that point in time, the case becomes indefensible. Maybe it was a close call. Maybe it was defensible. It's not any longer. Like, you are dead in the water on that case. More importantly, it gives rise to what's called punitive damages. Now I have damages that can punish a system or punish a physician. And then thirdly, you could lose your ticket over that. You could lose your license for something like that. Part of me getting punitives is proving the system ratified you altering the records. One of the ways that I can prove ratification is that they kept you employed. And so now their motivation is, I got to fire this doctor. And once that doctor's fired, imagine trying to get a job again when you try to explain why you were fired, along with the fact that the case had to be settled and now is part of the National Practitioners Database, and they're surely going to put it under your name because your alteration of records is why that happened. So I will tell you, I'm working on a bunch of cases right now where physicians went back in notes and tried to delete things. And if you do that, you're going to get caught. 100%.
Yeah, that's wild. I mean, we've all gone back and modified a chart, minutes later when you're like, oh, I forgot to put, that I did this procedure, I did this or whatever. I've done that a million times. But to your point, in a high risk case, if you get notified 3 months, 6 months later, the first thing they tell you to do is don't go back to the chart and make any changes. That's like 101. But I mean, to your point, like I said, we don't get a lot of this education on what do you do when there is something that went wrong. And to your point, like, I like what you said, sit down at the bedside, make that apology. I wasn't aware of the apology statute. So I think that's a good thing, obviously. And I think that kind of leads to, this thing of what should a physician do when there's that bad outcome, to which you touched on. So I appreciate you doing that.
Yeah. I want to make a couple of things clear about documentation to put you at ease. There is a attribution key that I can get. Okay. What that shows is exactly what you did when and when you wrote it in the chart. So let's take your job for an example. If there's a 4-hour ER visit and you're doing note taking throughout, or maybe at the end, and that attribution key is going to show me things, and you're protected in that setting. Like, you put things in within that ER visit or later that day, or even the next day, you're fine. Where people get themselves in trouble is maybe 5 days down the line, where you catch word that, oh my gosh, the patient you saw 5 days ago died, and you go in the chart then. Okay. At that point, you're at a fork in the road. One way is you could put in there addendum, late entry, and you put the date of 5 days later to make it clear. I am writing this note 5 days later as a late entry, as an addendum. And then you put things in there. Understand, whatever you put in there in that addendum is certainly going to be looked at very carefully and with some suspicion on my side. But the fact that you made it clear that you were doing this later to clarify the record is going to give you that ability to use that note later in litigation. The other side of the fork is the bad side, is to go in 5 days later, doctor your note, change the note, delete things, and not come clean about it. And then later, my EMR expert group can not only, I want you to know this, they can find that you went in, but we have instances where an entire progress note was deleted and rewritten. We can get that deleted progress note. Like, you may have deleted it, but it stays alive in the system. And just imagine when we compare those two notes.
Oh man. Yeah.
It's just bad news.
Yeah. No, I can honestly tell you, I've never done that, and I wouldn't recommend it. I didn't even know that type of stuff went on, but I guess there's bad apples everywhere in that regard.
And, there's no more, there's very few written charts, But just to cover it for people, if you still are taking, written progress notes, the way I would catch people in those days would be if you write a progress note, there's invariably something underneath that page, right? And you wrote and imprinted in the page below it. And so later, if you go back and add to it, it has shifted. And so that's how we would see that they altered written notes, is from the impressions on the pages underneath. And, we caught many, many people adding to progress notes, and again, taking progress notes, ripping them out, throwing them away, writing all new progress notes. We're able to capture both progress notes and print it in the page underneath it. So if you still archaic and have a written record, that's the way you're going to get caught too.
For sure. Well, let's do a little fact or fiction here. You ready for that?
I am.
So I know these are some things that the physicians would definitely want to know, but fact or fiction, apologizing increases chance of litigation.
That is absolute fiction. 100% apologize. You're protected by the statute in Ohio. And more importantly, I think you gain equal footing from an empathetic standpoint with the patient and their family. And they immediately have affinity for you. And I think you're unlikely to get sued.
All right, great. Fact or fiction, waiving a patient's bill is an admission of fault.
Fiction. Absolute. Again, fiction. I think that the patient will appreciate that. In today's day and age with HSAs and this high deductible, they're going to get socked. And I would say, take a look at it from the opposite side. Imagine horrible negligence. And then when you finally get home and you're trying to recover, you get that bill and United Healthcare is like, you owe $7,500. You are 100% going to call a lawyer when you may have had doubt beforehand. So I see, more upsides than downsides on the bill. And, lastly on that, I have never crossed the doctor and said, oh, by the way, you wrote the bill off. Where would that get me? People would be like, well, they're just a nice person.
Right.
Right.
All right. Fact or fiction, last one. Good bedside manner reduces the likelihood of litigation.
100%. And the flip side is just, so apparent. I don't know what it is with surgeons, but I've seen more of them have, just terrible outcomes. And then they're either rude and quick to people or they don't see people at all. And then they're trying to wonder why they have so many lawsuits. I just think sitting down, looking people in the eye and just being honest with them and keeping your voice low and answer, any other questions? Is there anything else I can help you? Here's my number to my, if you don't want to give your cell phone out, here's the number to our PA. They'll get in touch with me right away. I'll call you back. Those types of things are invaluable and I think are going to save you many, many lawsuits in the future.
Yeah, I agree. One of the things that I do personally is I try to smile in every single patient room, no matter what the situation is. And if it's appropriate, I try to generally make my patients laugh or the families. Not always, because it may not be appropriate. Laughter may not be appropriate for that moment. But and I feel like that's served me well over the years. And knock on wood, I haven't been on the witness stand yet. But that I think the smiling, and I think that was a big thing during COVID, was when everybody was wearing the masks. My patient SAT scores dropped tremendously. And I think it's because people couldn't see my smile behind the face there. So that was always something that I think served me well. So
I think that's a big point. And you just raised something I want to mention. One of the things that kills a relationship quicker, there's a few things that kill it quicker, is being dismissive. And I know it's hard sometimes because you're in a rush, you're a little frustrated, and you got the wife or the husband who's like, I found this on Claude, or I found this, on ChatGPT. You want to be dismissive, but just think of the opposite. If you're like, it's interesting. I'll give that some thought, and you leave the room, and guess what goes on in that room? The spouse is like, thank you for bringing that up. And that's an important relationship in that room. And they've now become, they have a lot of affinity for you because you listen to them. You might think it's complete baloney, but just don't be dismissive. Like, I got this. I've been doing this a long time. Why don't you just let me handle it? That's the easiest way to corrupt a relationship, I think, whether it's the spouse or the patient.
Yeah, and I teach this all the time when I do a lot of teaching. And one of the things I agree with you. I think the vast majority of healthcare professionals, when they hear, I saw this on Google, this is my concern, as outlandish as it may be, I think most healthcare providers get frustrated. And I will tell
Yeah.
you, God's honest truth, I welcome that because number one, it's a double check for me. And number two, you're telling me what you're concerned about. I can address that concern. Now, that doesn't mean I need to do a CT or an MRI or whatever the case may be, but at least I know now you've given me the answer to the test. You've given me, this is what I'm concerned about. This is why I'm here today, which, by the way, some patients aren't very skilled at telling you why they're there. They may give you a chief complaint. I'm here because I have a headache, but they may not tell you that grandma died from a brain aneurysm, and that's really what they're concerned about. But if they tell me that, then to me, that's like the golden ticket to like why they're there. So I agree with you. I think most people get frustrated. I try to use that as a very big positive, as they're giving me the open book test. Like, here you go. Here's what I need today. And I think that is, I can use that to my advantage and make sure I still have to do my workup, but I also have to address their concerns, no matter how outlandish it may seem at that time. So I welcome it, to be honest.
You just hit on a point I think I forgot to make about, how can you feel comfortable with your care not leading to a lawsuit? One of the things that I thought about when I was a defense lawyer, that if I had a case where you, the ER doctor, had in a note, the complaint, the history, all of the relevant things. And then the most important thing was you laid out your thought process. And then you made a conclusion. And let's say in the end, your conclusion was wrong. I could still defend you and win that case. But if your note didn't have the bones of all that, and your note didn't provide kind of a logical way of thinking, I would probably lose that case. So I just think it's very important to not only put that in the chart, but describe that to the patient. I thought about that when you were talking about the patient who's gone to an AI explanation. You may say to them, like, listen, that's interesting you bring that up. Let me walk through what I'm thinking and why I'm probably still not going to do the CT scan. But if I do this test and it turns out to be negative, I might go to the CT scan, and you explain that to them, they're going to be fine.
Yeah, and
but if you just dismiss them,
right,
then I think you got problems.
Yeah, and that's what I teach the residents all the time. Put your thoughts in that paragraph. That paragraph is the most important paragraph in the entire, document for the ER. I mean, yes, history is important, physical is important, but what's important are your thoughts. Like, I considered doing a CAT scan to rule out a PE, but the patient's not tachycardic, they're not hypoxic, whatever. You could still be wrong, but at least you've demonstrated that you've met the standard of care. You've gone through that process. You've considered those things, and you had reasoning. The reasoning may be flawed, but at least you put your thoughts on paper on that. So
100%. If you take a DVT PE case in the ER, okay, which I see a lot of, and your note is completely devoid of any idea that either of those things were in your differential diagnosis, okay? And now I'm sitting down to take your deposition, okay? I can tell you right now, one of the first questions I'm going to ask you is, was DVT in your differential diagnosis? That is a very difficult question for you to answer now, because if you say, yes, it was, it's not anywhere in your note. And you're stuck with, but I thought it. And I'm like, okay, let me get this straight. You thought about something that could lead to someone's death, and you just didn't put it in the note. It's pretty non-believable. The flip side of it is, no, I got to be honest with you, I didn't think about it at all. And if you didn't, and there's enough things in there, I think that's a very difficult case to defend too. So I think, yeah, you've got to give those thought processes, even some differential diagnosis, why you ruled them out. And I can defend that case and win it 10 times out of 10, I think.
Okay. Well, I'm glad to have that. So I try to put the final spin on the show as a sort, a little bit more of a positive note. Like, if a young doctor's listening, like, what would you tell them to focus on in order to have like a long, successful career, not be necessarily completely paranoid, of some of these situations that we've talked about?
I mean, I think there's a lot in there. There's a lot of subspecialties that I see that I think a physician can still, make a good living on, and, still have some family life, and kind of had less brush with insurance companies, and those are out there that you got. I would focus on some of that, not necessarily hey, this is what I love, although that's got to be part of it. I think being a physician is an incredibly noble profession, and I still encourage a lot of people to do it. But I think they really need to educate themselves on the interplay between private equity, insurance company, and medicine, and maybe educate themselves and become, really an advocate to get control back in physicians' hands. Because until the group of physicians and care providers get together and mobilize and realize that they're the central force, I don't see this situation changing. So I think you guys got to take control. People have to be more advocates for patients and for themselves before this is going to change. The last thing I would say is I would not be afraid of plaintiffs' attorneys. I think what I've shown here is that I have an understanding of the system. I think you, as care providers, are actually victims inside the system. And I can spot the areas that need to be changed. And perhaps there's some room there for physicians and plaintiffs' attorneys to work together to effectuate that change. And I think there is.
Yeah, I love it. And I think that's why we're here today. And, again, I thank you for coming on the show. What's one thing you'd like patients to hear? Because I do think you touched on something earlier about, patient accountability. And I think one of the things that drives us nuts in healthcare, like if you go and buy something today at Lowe's and you have a problem with it, like you wouldn't return it to Target. But we get this all the time in the emergency room. Patients have surgery at hospital A and they come to my small community hospital B, and I don't have any of the records. I have no idea what happened, and they are demanding answers. And I'm like, can you go back to the place where they saw you, where they have your records? So what's something that you would want patients to hear if they were listening to this show?
Yeah, I think, you raised a great point that you have to use your common sense. If you had surgery at a facility, unless it's like an emergency, you can't get, back there, you've got to return there. I do think when patients are bebopping around in different hospitals and different ERs, and I've seen it, they're doing themselves a disservice. But I think the number one thing I would tell patients is that you need to educate yourself on what you're having, whatever that procedure is, or what may be wrong. And more importantly, you have to pick an advocate to go in with you. I think it's incredibly important to have a spouse, a sister, a child who understands that you can't go in there, be a jerk and yell and scream. That's not going to get you anywhere. But someone to just be like, hey, I've seen my sister's vital signs kind of trending in this direction. Is there anything to be worried about? Nurse. No, there's not. I see this all the time. It persists. Hey, I know you said there's nothing to worry about, but is there a way you could, have the resident come in? Like, I'd like to speak to the physician, please. Okay. And they're not going to say no. And if they do, you got to go up the chain of command at that point. So I think having someone who's a patient, kind, professional advocate there is really going to help you from slipping through the cracks.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Especially in this broken system that we've talked about for the last hour, you have to be an advocate. There's a way to do it, but you do have to have an advocate. And, I find myself now with my parents and family members, they reach out to me and I'm just like, I shake my head sometimes. I'm like, how the heck did this happen? Like, we need to send somebody with you to your next appointment. Just another set of ears, another set of eyes can be helpful. But, even as the director for the emergency room, I'm telling you, when you come to see us, have someone with you that can help you and be another set of eyes on, for everybody's best, outcome. That's what we want. And yeah. I do think it can be helpful, and it is necessary because the system is broken, like we talked about.
Yeah. I'll tell you a funny quick story that will resonate with you as an ER doctor. My uncle went to the ER like 8 a.m, and my aunt called me and she said, here's what his symptoms are. And I was like, he has a spinal epidural abscess. And she's like, they're about to discharge us. And I'm like, no, here's what you do. Ask the following 3 questions of the PA. And that was at 8:30 a.m. Okay. You cut to 9 p.m. that night. He finally had the MRI results back that showed, guess what? A thoracic spinal epidural abscess. Had they not called me, he undoubtedly would have gone home and would be paralyzed today from about nipple line down. So that's just an example of kind of an advocate. I knew what I was talking about. I gave her a couple questions, just 3 questions. And it turned out to be, the information that he needed to get that workup. Alibi slow, as we've, already seen. That's how long it takes sometimes in today's world. But yeah, advocates can really change the outcome of a patient.
Absolutely. So on a lighter note, what's a stereotype of malpractice attorneys that you think might be true?
Might be true. Well, I mean, everyone calls us ambulance chasers, which is strange. I've never seen anyone chase an ambulance, but I will say, like, if someone is talking to me in a social setting about a situation, my first thought is, well, I hope they're okay. And my second thought is, like, they probably should go talk to a lawyer. So you're definitely always seeing fact patterns that are like, maybe they should see a lawyer. So I definitely think that's true. Our mind is always churning towards the next case.
I bet. I mean, you probably get that at parties. I mean, at parties, I'm always like, I dread going to parties and having people know that I'm a physician or whatever. That stereotype is definitely true. Like, I will undoubtedly have someone come up to me and be like, so I've had this belly pain for the last 6 months. And so what do you think about that? And I'm like, oh my God, like, is this really happening?
I don't understand people. They need to understand we need to rest and relax too, but you'll always get the text on a Sunday and it's just like, hey, we haven't talked in a long time, but let me just run this past you. And you're like, what do I do now? Because if you give advice and it's wrong, and you haven't really seen the patient in your setting. So yeah, I feel bad for you guys for sure.
Well, you did say rest and relax. I know that we are both very avid travelers, and I know we need to get away and decompress from some of this stuff, some of this chaos that we're in.
Yeah.
Tell me about what you like to do outside of the courtroom, or your favorite trip that you've taken. I know you've taken some wild trips, which I love, and I definitely need to follow you more on social media to kind of partake in some of this. But tell me about something that sticks out in your mind.
Generally speaking, what I would say to any United States citizen is if you haven't taken the time to travel over to old Europe, France, Italy, Greece, Spain, that you got to do that. Because, I grew up, middle class. I didn't have a chance to do that growing up. I didn't set foot in Europe until I was 50, 7 years ago. And what I realized is the architecture, the art, the restaurants, the food, the culture, the people who are so nice, is just a rich context to your life that we don't have here in the United States. They slow down. They don't work on a Saturday. They don't work on a Sunday. They sit and spend a little extra time with that cup of coffee or with that red wine in the evening. And I would say that is just so enriching, especially if you can experience all those things with the people that you love, your wife and your kids. So I would just, I would really urge people to get out of the United States and see what's out there, because I think they will really love it. And it will, as they come back to the United States, I think it'll change your life. You'll slow down a little bit and you'll enjoy that meal a little bit more, and you'll take a little bit more time, in the afternoon, or you'll take the nap or skip something at work that you can skip. So that's where I see the advantages of travel, in addition to the experiences you have with your family.
Yeah, I love the perspective, and you're absolutely right. Over in Europe, they certainly know how to slow things down. And I find myself every time I go to Italy and then I come back, I'm like, we're just grinding too hard over here. And it is good to sometimes just slow down and have that cup of coffee. And I think that's why we travel so much, to sort of wash the bad out of the brain and fill it up with some good, too. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. My favorite place is south of France for those reasons. Yeah.
South of France. Nice. I've not been there. Every time I go over there, I have a lot of family in Italy. So if I feel like if I'm going that far, I might as well go to Italy, and I have a little bit of vacation time and then some family time as well. So
we got to talk. It's an amazing place, but thanks so much for having me on. This has been awesome.
Yeah, this has been great. I can't thank you enough. To tease my next show, I'm going to be doing AI in healthcare. Specifically in emergency medicine. And so I think I'm really excited to talk about that with an upcoming guest. So that's going to be my next focus. But I can't thank you enough for joining us today. I think you brought a tremendous amount of value to the listeners, and to everybody that's joined us today. We thank you. You can find us Emergency Minute on any podcast platform. We're on Google, we're on Apple, Spotify. We are now video on YouTube as well. And we can put Steve Crandall's contacts in the show notes as well. But I appreciate your time today, and I don't take this personally, but I hope never to have to see you sitting on the other side of the bench. Would be quite terrifying for me, but I truly am grateful for your expertise and bringing that to our listeners today.
Absolutely. I've heard that said to me many times before. No offense taken. I've enjoyed it. I welcome any listener, whether it's a physician, care provider, patient, reach out to me. I'm at Crandall and Para. We're injuryverdicts.com. But I'd be happy to, speak to anybody, whether it's about a potential case or, more importantly, any physician that I can help any issue with, that we talked about today. So thank you very much. I've really enjoyed myself.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And to all our guests out there, peace, love, and happiness to everyone out there. Cheers, everyone.
Thanks for joining us this week on Emergency Minute. Join us next time for more hard-hitting discussions on some of today's issues in healthcare. Don't forget to leave us a review on Spotify or follow on social media at Dr. J. Parente.